Okay, so in terms of my philosophy of assessment, I never really started off with a solid one before this semester. This is partially because, in my opinion, I think they do a lot more focus on summative, informative, and of learning, as learning, for learning in the major classes of the humanities subjects, so English and social and that, and probably a bit in science too. In math, we do this, but we do it in a different way. So, in terms of like proper theorists and the terminologies that we use in ed, I wasn't super familiar or comfortable with them before this. So this isn't necessarily saying I don't know what it is. We did talk about it, of course, once in ECS, but it wasn't really strong. But that being said, I've always related really closely towards the cognitivism theorems and theories related to learning and assessment. So, kind of the idea that learning builds off of experience and learning memories build off of other memories. So the stronger the memory, the more background it has, essentially. And with that, you don't just remember stuff freely. So with English, you could just write the draft or you could just write the essay right out. But if you make an outline or some sort, that creates kind of a fundamental foundation memory. And then when you go towards building the actual draft off of that, it's actually that much stronger, and your understanding and knowledge related to it retains a lot more and a lot richer detail just because you did that first fundamental memory. So that's the way to describe it in English, and that's the best way I have of describing it in my head. But I also found it really cool that it's actually the cognitive constructivist theorem, because before I related to some things in constructivism, but not fully. I found I was more related, or I aligned closer to cognitivism. So it's nice to know that they actually are related. And as was read in Mary James, yes, just want to make sure I did that right. So as I read in Mary James, they actually like cognitivism is almost an accumulation of all sorts of different types of theories. So it has a bit of cognitivism, but it has a bit of positivism, and it has a bit of behavioralism, and a bit of social justice. So that's kind of neat too. But for me, the reason I find that to be kind of my basis for my kind of ideas, beliefs, and a philosophy related to assessment and learning is because it's about the mind. Cognitivism is focused on your mind and how you process information, retain information, and develop information within your head. And while I don't want to relate this to the idea of just straight memorization, because I don't believe in that, I do think that we as educators don't think enough about that idea of information processing. We consider adaptions and stuff, but we don't look deeply into the idea of what does it mean to information process and how do we psychologically process information well. So if you ask around, not a lot of people know that if you review something within 24 hours of your first learning of it, you will retain that information a lot quicker. They might know that just because of kind of drill based memorization, but just the idea that cognitively you will retain the information better if you revisit that information within 24 hours from your first experience of it. And I learned that through choir from Dr. Dominic Gregoro. But with that, that applies to everything in education. So for me, my philosophy of assessment is very much rooted in cognitivism. And now that I'm coming out of the semester, I have a lot of ideas related to the actual assessment and the evaluation of it. So for me, like, if you ask me what is assessment, I previously wouldn't really have been able to answer really well. I would have said maybe it's test, it's quiz, it's your marks. That's what assessment is. But now that I look at it, I'm thinking, okay, what does a doctor do when they assess a patient? What does adjuster do when they assess a situation related to a car, or a police officer or a fire department assess a scenario? These are taking a broad look, a snapshot of what's occurring, and they are making kind of assumptions, analysts, and evaluations of that content. So, in terms of teaching, assessment is literally taking a snapshot of the student's understanding. And it is saying, where's the student at? What feedback can you give to them? And how can you make them grow further? And for me, I struggle with the difference of assessment and evaluation. Not that I think they're the same, but in the terms of I don't know if I would place evaluation as a subset of assessment or as a coset. So, in some ways, I think that assessment breaks into summative and formative, and I think evaluation is a subset of the summative, as in it's an assessment which is designed to be very numerical friendly for the teacher. But in other ways, I think evaluation is just a coset. It's separate, but it's connected intrinsically because evaluation is very much about the idea of compiling months and months and months of assessment and maybe having a final evaluation based assessment and then combining this information, compiling it, and then you as a teacher making a judgment call on what the grade should be. And this should be an unbiased, unsubjective judgment call. So that's why a lot of people go with a very grade-based approach, because then you can just say, there's the grade. But in the end of things, it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. You could go trends-based, or you could go commutative, but like it's the idea of evaluation's the compilation of assessment in my mind. So it's separate but related. Just gonna move this quickly. So then when we're doing that, we can move into the idea of what's the best way to go about assessment and that, and like how do you know students understand? And so for me, like this goes back to the assessment idea. I personally believe that assessment is assessing the student's understanding. So the second question answers the first question in the idea that you're taking a snapshot of the student's understanding. Everything related to teaching and assessment is related to understanding. And the minute we get away from that and look at content, we are having issues, because if we go straight content based, then we're going to be assessing their memorization skills. Whereas if we look at their understanding, we're going to be assessing their understanding and their actual knowledge of and richness of what they've retained from you. So in terms of how they know, ultimately for me, the best way to determine that someone has understood and fully, deeply accepted and kind of evaluated the facts for themselves is if they can teach it to someone. And this could be in a presentation format, this could be in a flipped classroom format. In terms of math, I don't fully know how to do it, but I think that if you can teach something to another person, or if you can share your views in a clear, concise way to another individual, you have proven that you have deep understanding within that topic. If you can recite it to someone, that's memorization. But if you can explain it, that's understanding. And there's a key difference there. That's where you tip the kind of boat from that memorization to the kind of meaningful memories. So that's kind of my basis for what is assessment and how do you know that you've successfully assessed a student as an understanding. And then the other key part of this is I personally believe that we aren't in a performance-based curriculum here. Like when you look at a grade, in high school, the grades were for me performance. How well you know this, but it was also how hard of a worker you are and how good are you at this. But I don't think that's necessarily what we should be doing. So like in terms of understanding, do you understand all the outcomes? We chastise people and just make very negative connotations towards anyone who does 100%. But in my opinion, if a student proves that they fully understand every part of that curriculum related to that course, every outcome and every indicator, and if you have the data to back it up through formative, summative assessment, and regular assessment, not just midterm quiz, do regular assessments. Smaller but more frequent gives you more data and better data. And if you can do that and you can prove it and back up your facts, then I truly believe that you should be able to back up the idea of giving a student 100%. you should be able to say that they have understood all this content. So we have this issue where we want to challenge our students, and it's not an issue. That's a good thing, but we have to have a balance. We should be challenging our students, but we also need to be careful not to punish those students who meet the standards, because meeting expectations should mean 100. And that's where I struggle, because I want to challenge students. So I would look at maybe doing 95s or that, but then I really don't know how to do that in a way where that would be fair. So this is where I'm honestly leaning more and more as I go further into education, that do they understand? Check. You can almost do it like a checklist. And for mathematics, we have this new concept coming up, which is called concept check. And it's like quizzes, but it's different. So the traditional quiz test exam format is you might do the quiz here and there, and then you have unit exams, midterms, and finals. And these are very traditional and very memory-based. The idea of a concept check is it's frequent. So some people do it weekly. Some people do it more than weekly. It depends. And they're small. They're like 1 or 2 questions. And if a student can get one right, they'd get, like some people do, they need to get it right twice. So you might do a concept check and the student gets it right, that's an 80. Then the next time they get 100. And that's to prevent the idea of a fluke. So maybe they just happened to remember then, but they didn't actually understand it enough to repeat that. So that's that repetition, but it's not drills. That's the kind of the cognitive idea of memory. You're developing on the previous one. So if they can prove that they can do it more than once, that's part of the assessment and how you know they've understood. They can do it. They can demonstrate it, and they can show it. And I think this is almost a way of like doing this idea of a non-traditional alternative form. It's not perfect. It's not a normal, like it's still very traditional, but that's, I think, one of the best ways to disrupt mathematics, because the idea is that you can repeat these constantly, and you can constantly, like you get a limited repeats. And if eventually within the span of a semester you show that you can repeat and successfully demonstrate your understanding of that twice, you'll get 100% of that portion. So theoretically, you can get 100% in the class with that. And then you have to write the final in a midterm still, and that's just because most school boards require that. So if you can get away with that, awesome. But that's one form of like an alternative, non-traditional. Another one is trends, and it's the idea you do constant formative assessments. And you might do a summative one, but it's like a scale of 1 to 10, where are you? Or which might be subjective, but as it builds on, it helps. So essentially you give feedback-based assessment all throughout the semester, but then each unit you would kind of rank it with a score, and you'd give it a trend. And a trend isn't an average. So if you're at a 1, 2, 5, 5, 5, 5, or whatever, a trend is saying, where do you think this is going to go? And the student would trend themselves, and then the teacher would trend them. And when you get to the midterm, the student would then do a portfolio assignment, and it's kind of a demonstrate what you have learned. And it's literally the student does a presentation on everything they've learned. This can happen in math. It's kind of neat to think about. And the idea is the student demonstrates, and they show the teacher everything they've learned, and the teacher can then, using that and using their trends, assess and then evaluate them for that grade. But then if the student misses aspects, or they have problems that they need to resolve, then heading into the second part of the semester, they can work towards resolving those well, building the new content. And by the final, they have the possibility to, again, show their understanding, but then it redeems and repeats and upgrades previous knowledge as well as new knowledge. So I think this is an ultimate, that's probably the extreme for math, like non-traditional way. It's fully based on trends and show me what you know, rather than grades and answer this question. And I think in a way that's like, again, that's that idea of teaching. If you can teach something, then you've proved your understanding. Because when you teach something, when you explain something to someone, that tells me that you know it enough that you can do it, and you know it enough that you can rephrase that in a format that can be transferred to another person. And that requires a fairly deep amount of understanding. It's not just a memorization. So that's kind of my idea of like a non-traditional way, and it makes it a bit more equitable for people, because there's a lot of people that can explain and do a hands-on, like lab type of assessment, but they can't do an exam, or they don't succeed in the exam. And with math, we're very bad about being stuck in that traditional exam, and so that's two ideas I want to do to kind of further myself out. I'm probably going to lean towards concept checks, but the trends might be an interesting way to eventually maybe try it, even for just a unit. So lastly, kind of, I guess another alternate form is using a rubric. And for me, just a way to critique what we've learned. I like the idea of success criteria, and I would be interested in trying them in math, but my issue with the success criteria is where a rubric has biasness in the fact of what's the difference between a 4 and a 5. I find a success criteria has the same thing, because you don't have defined grades, which is good, but I find it limits creativity while also causing anxiety related to the grades, because essentially you list everything like a checklist, but then how do you know how much box 1 and box 2 are worth? I know they can eliminate to 20% after here, but what do those mean? And how does that feedback translate into a grade? And at university level, I think this works very well, but at a high school level, I can't see that being a very good way, because I don't know if the teacher would be able to justify themselves very well. Although with the types of assessment we sometimes do nowadays still, you might be fine. So for me, I would actually probably lean more towards a checklist and a rubric. So the checklist is for the students, that's the assignment. That's telling them, what do you do? And then the rubric is the actual numeric grades with good quality descriptors inside, saying exactly what that is. So essentially, that does the job of the success criteria, but then it gives that clear grading scheme. So there's literally no deep bias. Whereas I think you can be subjective with the one. I think if you have a very good rubric, the subjectivity should be lower, in my opinion, despite kind of what we discussed. And then if you have a dispute, have a fellow educator come in to kind of critique that. You can always back on other people. You can get second opinions, and then that's further leading away the subjectivity of it. So, I think in math, it would actually be easier to implement a rubric with a checklist than it would be a success criteria. But that's just me, I suppose. And in the end of things, I personally am always thinking of ways to move away from subjectivity and subjectiveness. And for math, it's supposedly easier, but in the end it's not, because math is an art. It's not an explicit science. So with math, you can solve stuff in 7 different ways. Which way is right? And so that's where the idea of a rubric's neat, because you can do something related to the math content shown, and you do something related to the solution shown and the justification shown, and maybe multiple solutions